Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
When you hear the word volcano, where in the world do you think of? Mount Vesuvious in Italy? Mount Fuji in Japan? Maybe Cotopaxi in Ecuador? Do you ever think of Lassen Peak? This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. The national park system is full of volcanoes, some active, some dormant, some extinct. They all have fascinating stories to tell. There was a series of eruptions of Lassen Peak between 1914 and 1917, with the 1915 eruption largely playing a role in the establishment of Lassen Volcanic National Park. Today we're going to be discussing Lassen Peak and its volcanism, along with Andy Calvert, the scientist in charge of the California Volcano Observatory, and Jessica Ball, the observatory's volcano hazards and communication specialist. We'll be back in a minute with Andy and Jessica.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
So, welcome to the Traveler, Andy, Jessica.
Thanks. Delightful to be here.
Thank you.
You know, it's great to be able to sit here and talk with you guys because volcanoes and volcanics are a special interest of mine. I went to school for journalism in college, and unfortunately, I waited till my last semester, my senior year, to take a geology course. And I think if I took that my first semester, I might have been a geologist instead of a journalist. But nevertheless, they really fascinate me. And, you know, when you talk about the California Volcano Observatory, people hear that name and the word volcano sticks out. And at the same time, I think it's hard to immediately think of a volcano in California. I mean, the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory practically sits on a volcano, as does the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. And when you mention the Cascades Volcano Observatory, you know, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Hood might come to mind. But California, what is your area of observation?
Yeah, California is known for its earthquakes, known for Yosemite and such. California has fantastic volcanoes. Mount Shasta up on the north end next to Oregon is actually the largest stratovolcano in the Cascades. Medicine Lake, Lassen, Mammoth Mountain, Long Valley Caldera, Mono Lake, Clear Lake. We've got a lot of volcanoes in California. They're mostly around the edges, mostly away from where most people live, but not really. There are towns right next to some of them. There's a national park on one of them, and people are exposed.
What about Nevada? I mean, I look at Nevada and it's kind of a flat spot between Utah and California.
Nevada's interesting. Nevada doesn't have volcanoes that we actively monitor. It's capable of having volcanoes. There are young volcanoes there. They tend to be distributed around, and they aren't ones that erupt multiple times. So we talk about distributed volcanism in the Southwest, and a lot of it's in the desert Southwest, and they're sort of one-off eruptions that might last for days, weeks, months, years, and there are a lot of them. There are essentially three ways to make a volcano. You can have a sort of a hot blowtorch on the bottom of the crust like Hawaii, or you can add water to hot places and cause melting, or you can actually get hot rocks closer to the surface. And when you talk about Nevada, you're actually getting hot rocks closer to the surface by crustal extension. I can explain that if you like.
Well, I'm wondering, where in Nevada would you encounter that?
Yeah, so there are volcanoes. As you're flying over, you'll see lava flows sticking out here and there that are definitely erupted in the last 50,000 years, some the last 10,000 years. There's a Mar volcano called Soda Lakes that's east of Reno in the Carson Sink.
And what type of volcanoes are they, or were they?
So they were volcanoes where you had you create a Mar. Actually, Jessica should answer this question because that's one of her specialties is Mar volcanism. Take it away.
Okay. So you create a Mar volcano when you have magma rising in the crust that encounters groundwater at very shallow levels. And the combination of the hot rock and the groundwater boils very quickly, turns into steam, and then expands explosively. And that blasts out a crater, which creates, a feature right on the surface of the ground. Usually they build up a little ring of debris and material, but they're not a big, tall cone like you would normally think of a stratovolcano.
Well, in Yellowstone just a few weeks ago, we had what they described as a hydrothermal explosion. Would that be a Mar volcano? I mean, it didn't create a big crater. It just threw some stuff up and 600-foot plume of steam and debris and whatnot.
It's a similar process, but the difference is that in Yellowstone, the only thing involved was hot water. And in those geyser systems, in those hot springs, sometimes water becomes superheated and builds up pressure and steam and just explodes after it reaches some tipping point. With a Mar volcano, you're actually involving magma. So in the deposits around those, you will find pieces of young lava that was created during the eruption.
Interesting. And so, when was the last Mar volcano eruption in Nevada?
Ooh, that's a good one.
We don't have a date on the one that erupted that Soda Lakes that's out by Carson Sink. We're working on it with colleagues at the University of Nevada, Reno. It was most likely in the last 10,000 years, and they're difficult things to date. Jessica can talk about this at length too, because a lot of the ways that we date rocks require certain textures of rocks or certain preservation, or the presence of carbon-14, like burned little bits that we can date. And Mars are really, really difficult for that, because the stuff that comes out on the surface is sort of a slurry of mud and gunk, and it's not the kind of normal fiery stuff that we think about when we think about volcanic eruptions.
Sure. Very, very technical words there, mud and gunk. I like that. Now, volcanoes come in three flavors, right? I mean, you've got active, extinct, and dormant. What types of volcanoes are in your region, Nevada and California?
So these are volcanoes that aren't currently erupting. We had an eruption in California last between 1914 and 1917. There was an eruption out of the top of Lassen Peak. And so as geologists, we consider the Lassen Volcanic Field active. And I work hard on Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta hasn't erupted for 3,200 years. I consider it active. But active doesn't really necessarily mean coming out of the top. When we talk about active volcanoes, we imply, or we think about there being some sort of melt fraction at depth, and that they're capable of erupting. So that's kind of our working definition of active volcanoes. There are, Kilauea in Hawaii is a volcano that erupts frequently. It's on, a couple of times a year we'll get magma up at the surface. Currently, there isn't, it's not currently erupting magma, but it's dang close. And we're watching it 24/7, and quite likely in the next days, weeks, couple of months, we're going to see an eruption there. And so that's clearly an active volcano, but there's a semantic problem really of, if I say, well, Mount Shasta is an active volcano, and people scratch their heads and look up there and don't see steam and ash coming out of the top, they question it.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. I mean, I've hiked to the top of Lassen Peak with my youngest son, and there's like a party atmosphere up there. Everybody was having a good time, drinking their beers, texting their friends across the country, and I wonder if any of them knew that they were standing atop an active volcano.
Yeah. Lassen is a remarkable place to visit. It's a place where you can see bubbling mud, you can see young eruptive deposits, you can hike up to the top pretty easily. It's a really nice trail. It's part of a day, and it is spectacular, and it's really it's undervisited. When people ask me where to visit, people talk about visiting Mount Shasta or Mount Rainier or something. I send them to Lassen because it is the most accessible place. It's kind of undervisited. It's a real gem.
We want to keep it that way. Is it safe to say that Lassen Peak is the most active volcano in your region?
No, not necessarily. It is certainly one of the ones that keeps us up at night. It's a capable area, and there are actually, Lassen Peak itself is not where most of the eruptions happen. A lot of them will happen on the flanks of Lassen, or off to the east. There are a variety of volcanoes that are sort of single distributed eruptions, or have kind of extended periods of eruptive activity. It's the Lassen Peak itself is a dome of kind of old volcanic rock. It's between 25 and 30,000 years, if I recall the correct age. And so having an eruption out of the top was a little bit surprising for the last eruption out of Lassen. Off to the north, there's Chaos Crags that erupted a little over 1,000 years ago, and that's a more typical eruption that we would expect from Lassen. There's another volcanic field down by Mono Lake. So Mono Lake has a number of eruptions that are it's an area that's even a bit more active than Lassen, and it's one that really does kind of keep us up at night, because there are many eruptions that have happened there in the last 10,000 years, and quite a few that have happened in the last 1,000 years. So these are places that are capable, and on kind of a geologic timescale, or even over 1,000 or a couple thousand years, are kind of erupting all the time. Over human lifespans, we might see an eruption in our lifetimes. We might not.
Yeah, I was going to get into that. I mean, I think there's a real confusion, I think, over human time and geologic time. I mean, in human time, it's been more than 100 years since Lassen Peak erupted. And yet in geologic time, that was like, what, a minute ago?
I mean, that's my day job when I'm not a manager and when I'm not running the California Volcano Observatory. I'm a geochronologist, and so I'm a geologist that dates rocks. I figure out, I'll go out and make geologic maps of active volcanoes, and by that we'll look for lava flows that came out individually or at about the same time and draw a line around them, and then collect rocks, bring them back, and figure out how old they are. I'm a geologic historian, really, and so by understanding the past behavior, understanding the when and the how big and the what the composition was, that'll tell us what's going to happen in the future. So we're sort of, trying to understand the past to inform the future and understand the system and protect communities from future eruptions.
Yeah, yeah. No, I know there's a rating system of how dangerous volcanoes are, and that seems to be a function of how close they are to populations. Is that correct?
That's part of it. Yeah, we have a lot of volcanoes in the United States of America, right? We know about Hawaii and Yellowstone, the Cascade Arc, these distributed ones we've been talking about in the Southwest. And then there are many, many, many up in Alaska that are on a big arc, the Alaska Aleutian Arc. And, there are people next to a lot of the volcanoes in the lower 48 or in Hawaii. There are also a lot of people that are adjacent to those volcanoes in Alaska. There are 25,000 people that fly through that airspace every day. And so we need to be cognizant of what these volcanoes can do, and then what sorts of infrastructure or people or transient populations that are moving through that space.
Talking about active volcanoes and dormant and extinct volcanoes, Lassen, I believe, is the only national park that has the 4 different types of volcanoes within its boundaries. Is that correct, Jessica?
That is correct. So we've already mentioned that Lassen Peak is a dome, an explosive volcano. We also have cinder cone, which is what we call a cinder cone or a scoria cone. There are older volcanoes in the region, which you would consider perhaps a shield volcano, much more, based on lava flows that have traveled long distances and created a lower peak. And let's see, what would be your 4th kind?
Did you hit composite?
Composite. Yeah, that's actually a term that we don't use a whole lot anymore. It's
The Park
sort of
Service term.
right. It's a midway term between, say, a stratovolcano and just a dome. We think of composite volcanoes as something that's been created by a bunch of lava domes and lava flows all piling on top of each other, but they might have explosive eruptions at some point.
Yeah. So you've got those 4 different types in Lassen Volcanic National Park. Are they all considered active? I mean, do they all feed off the same magma chamber, and so that makes them active, or are like the cinder cone a one-off?
So the cinder cone is a one-off. They are all fed by the same system, so the same sort of plumbing system, you could think of it. But that plumbing system has been around for a very long time, and so over time, maybe the main location of the vents that release magma from that system have changed a bit. Some of the older volcanoes in the area are millions of years old, and Lassen itself is actually a small part of a much larger, older volcano that's eroded away over time. So when you look at Lassen as a park now, what you're actually seeing are the guts of that older volcano.
Right, right.
Just following on that, the Broke-Off volcano just to the south, that was a real big stratovolcano 500,000 years ago. And the bubbling mud sort of altered area, geysers and such, or the kind of bump as hell, these hydrothermal areas are and in the guts of that older volcano. And there are places that you can stand in Lassen Park and look and see the eroded flanks of that volcano.
If somebody was taken blindfolded and dropped down there on the boardwalk in the heart of Bumpus Hill, they might think they were in Yellowstone National Park. I mean, the hot springs and the hot mud flows there are pretty unique. And is that, you said, what used to be the guts of Brokaw Mountain?
Yeah, so Brokaw was a big stratovolcano about 500,000 years ago, and that sort of Little Hot Springs Valley and Bumpus Hill there and Sulphur Works, that kind of stinky part that you drive through, that was all underneath the volcano, inside the volcano, and the area in the middle of it is really mined out by acid alteration, and that acid alteration's been active since about 400,000 years ago, and it's still active today. It moves around by little bits, but yeah, it's the guts, the eroded guts of a large stratovolcano.
Well, I'm curious, though, if you stand at the Sulphur Works or Bumpus Hill today, Brokaw Mountain is kind of to the southwest of where you're standing. It seems like a good distance away. Is what we see in Brokaw Mountain kind of like the rim of that stratovolcano, or how would you describe that?
The most hydrothermally active is sort of on the edge, that kind of eastern edge of the volcano. But if you walk to the middle of it, if you climb up, it's steep and not really a very pleasant walk, but there is a tremendous amount of acid altered rock in the middle that was actually in the core.
That's pretty cool. Now, I've heard the volcanic area around Lassen National Park, Lassen Volcanic National Park, referred to as the Lassen Volcanic Center. What exactly is that?
Well, Lassen's a little bit different than, say, Mount Rainier or Mount Shasta. At Mount Rainier and Mount Shasta, the vast majority of the eruptions happen from the summit or close to the summit, and you're constructing a central cone. What we currently have at Lassen is kind of an older eroded version of a cone like that. But then we have lots of little volcanoes all kind of coalescing into a really interesting volcanic area. So Lassen Peak itself is an older dome. Chaos Crags off to the north are young domes, kind of domes and flows. Jessica mentioned Cinder Cone off to the east that erupted in the year 1666. There are chains of volcanoes off to the east called the Poison Buttes. There are lots and lots of small volcanoes distributed over an area that's actually quite a bit larger than the park, up toward the Hat Creek Graben. And it's a part of the Cascade Arc that is it's extending. So the crust is rifting or spreading, and there are just lots of little ways for the magma to make it to the surface. Most of it follows along faults, and it's not coming out of one central vent.
So if you go down to Arizona, Sunset Crater Volcanic National Historic Site, I believe that is fed by the San Francisco Peaks system, for lack of my uneducated term. Is that similar to what you've got going in the Lassen Volcanic Center with this pocket of magma, so to speak, and a bunch of pipes going in different directions?
Yes, it is similar. So these fields, we call them volcanic fields. There's not really a great definition of what that means, but it usually means that it's got a variety of different kinds of activity over a long period of time, all in the same area. And you get these little one-off eruptions. Usually they're made of basalt or basaltic andesite, which has less silica in it. And we think of that as less evolved magma. It's magma that hasn't sat around in the crust for a while. It's coming straight up from deeper in the earth, in the mantle. And then you also get magma that has sat around in the crust, and it's assimilated the minerals that are around it, the rocks that are around it, and it has differentiated and become more silicic, more silica in it, stickier. So you start getting things like dacite and andesite and sometimes even rhyolite. And you get both in these areas. And that's what's responsible for the sort of variety of different volcanic landforms that you see in places like the Lassen Volcanic Center and the San Francisco Volcanic Field.
Is Lassen unique in having those four types of volcanoes within its boundary? I mean, do you normally see four different types so close together?
It's not unique. I'm sure that in the Mexican volcanic field, there are similar juxtapositions of those different volcanoes, and scattered around, certainly in Central America. In the US, it might be unique. Have to think harder about that. I mean, one of the things, Jessica brought up some terms, basalt and dacite and rhyolite. The shapes of volcanoes are pretty interesting, and they tell you a lot about the process under which they're formed. It's really the viscosity, or how sticky the lava is, tells you what the ultimate shape's going to be like. So if they're basalt, they're usually hot and fluid, and you get these sort of shield-shaped lavas that are not particularly steep. But then as you get to these other terms, andesite and dacite, the magma is a little bit cooler. It has more silica, and it's stickier. And so it's more like toothpaste than it is like water. And so you get steeper volcanoes. So if you compare Kilauea in Hawaii, which is a basalt shield volcano, to Mount Shasta, which is really an andesite dacite volcano, very steep and sticky. It's really the temperature and the viscosity, so how sticky that lava is, that guides the shapes of those volcanoes. And so if you go around the world and you look at volcanic centers that have lots of different shaped volcanoes, that's the answer to your question, really, is a place like Lassen does have many different shaped volcanoes, and that tells you that it's got some domes and some flows and some sticky stuff and some runny stuff. And you get that in a lot of these kind of volcanic arc centers, like in Mexico, like in Japan, like in Chile, like in the Cascades.
Interesting. Now, expanding a little bit, as you mentioned, your region includes Nevada. And if you go over to Death Valley National Park, you've got a popular attraction there in Yuba Hiba Crater. Dormant, extinct?
Probably Yuba Hiba craters is what we think of as a one-off. So it's an isolated eruption that happened in one place and probably won't happen in the same place again. It's not to say that you could never have another eruption there. Probably at some depths in the earth, there's still a plumbing system that could transmit magma to the surface, but right now we don't see any of the indicators that would tell us that that system is still running. We don't see earthquakes. We don't see the ground changing shape or level. We don't see gases. We just see nothing.
Lots of people down on the bottom hiking around. And which begs the question, how safe are these places? I mean, you said that Lassen Peak is considered an active volcano, and you've got all these people climbing up to the top and on the trails, and people going down into the bottom of Yuba Hiba crater. I'm guessing the signals would be enough in advance that you could close those areas off to the public.
Right. The good thing about volcanoes is that they almost always give us some indicator that they're waking up or getting ready to do something. whether that's weeks or months, sometimes even years in advance. We do see what I discussed before, the earthquakes, the gas, the deformation, because just by physically moving magma closer to the surface, you change the surface of the earth over it. You have to make room for that magma. So it breaks rock, it pushes things out of the way, sends smellier gases to the surface. So we hope that were places like Lassen or Ubi to do anything in the future, we would catch those signs long before we had an eruption.
Now, mixing Yellowstone with Lassen Volcanic, there was that hydrothermal explosion in Yellowstone a few weeks ago, and what I thought was really interesting was the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory. They've got their weekly Caldera Chronicles series of articles about the Yellowstone caldera and whatnot, and the one that week addressed hydrothermal explosions, and 2 days later we had the hydrothermal explosion. Could you have hydrothermal explosions in Bumpus Hell, the sulfur works area?
It is a possibility, although I think it's a little bit more remote in Lassen Park, simply because places like Yellowstone, they have very pressurized water in the plumbing systems for those geysers and those hot springs. That's the reason they have geysers, is because pressure builds up to a point, and then there's some sort of trigger that allows the pressure to be released through the geyser activity. Lassen has had geysers in the past, but it doesn't seem to have quite as much of that nowadays. It's not to say it will never happen. It certainly is a possibility for those kinds of explosions, but it's not as big or as violently active a system as you have in Yellowstone.
Yeah. How do we know that Lassen had geysers in the past?
They have been reported in the past by visitors to the park. I believe if you go back into the 19th century records, there have been records of some small geysers, not anything like Old Faithful, for example. But one of my favorite things to do is comb through old historical records or old newspapers or accounts of visitors to parks or other volcanic areas and find reports. And when they describe things, they describe them pretty much the same way that a scientist would these days. They're very good at recording things like that.
In the Bumpus Hell area or elsewhere?
I can't remember specifically.
I mean, obviously, access to parks is largely controlled by where the roads are, and I know in Yellowstone, in the backcountry, there's a lot of thermal features and whatnot. Is Bumpus Hell and the sulfur works the only visible thermal areas in Lassen?
No, there are several. So Little Hot Springs Valley and Mill Creek have hydrothermal areas too. And then I haven't been to this part of the park, but Drakesbad, I believe, also has some thermal features. The Bumpus Hell is the most active of these, and Sulphur Works too. But there are small hydrothermal areas scattered elsewhere in the park.
Yeah, yeah. Any indication that new thermal areas are coming to the surface in Lassen?
I don't think so. That would be a question best answered by Mike Klin, probably in our office, but I don't know of any.
Yeah. I know they had some road problems over by Sulphur Works, I think, with some of the hillside collapsing, and I don't know if that was just erosion or thermal activity.
Well, it's been a continued problem. I mean, that is all acid altered rock, and it is a very difficult place to build a road. It's been a problem since the park became a park, and they redid a lot of the road along Sulphur Works in the past decade, and some of that is already being undermined. It's a really difficult problem because the substrate there is just acid altered weak rock, and just not very competent to build on.
Hmm.
The road is there because people are really interested in the science, and it's worth having infrastructure to these places so people can visit and understand more about how the Earth works. But there is certainly some collateral damage of having to do more road work than you would if you put the road around a different way up over the mountain.
Sure, sure. Now, I'm curious, Andy. You said earlier that there are things that keep you awake at night. What kind of things are those when you talk about Lassen Peak or over in Nevada?
Well, these are large, complicated volcanic systems that we know pretty well. We think we know how they work. We study them, but there's active research at all of these volcanic centers, and we're learning about them all the time. When I say keeping us up at night, that's not every night, but typically every year or two or three at one or more of these centers, there will be sets of unrest, and that is often an earthquake swarm. So we'll have kind of over the period of, say, 1 to 5 or 10 days, we'll have many, many, many earthquakes in one particular spot. And that's really, kind of the Earth solving a space problem. There's a fault that's moving, or there are fluids that are moving, or maybe there's even magma injecting or something. And so when there's one of those times of swarms, we have a group of duty scientists. Jessica is one of them. I'm actually not a duty scientist in the group, but there are about a dozen who take turns really watching the data streams. And we can have gases that come to the surface. Up at Newberry Volcano near Bend a few years ago, there were kind of difficult to understand gas emissions. And so we paid a lot of attention to that. We get quite a few swarms at Lassen. We get swarms down at Mammoth Mountain. And so these are just places that we keep our eyes on. And if they do indicate that there's magma moving or there's an eruption imminent, we would contact partners and work with communities and populations to keep them safe. The USGS we aren't land managers, so we don't evacuate people. We don't decide what the response is. We're a science organization, and so we have a lot of partners at the national park, at Lassen Park, or in the Forest Service, whoever is managing the land, whether it's the sheriffs or the Forest Service or the park. And we're their partners in trying to tell them what the volcano is capable of, what it's doing currently, and what it could do.
I'm assuming it's easy to tell whether an earthquake is triggered by magma movement or tectonic plate movement. Is that
It
right?
actually isn't. Yeah, so there are some, we have seismologists who are specialists in this. Kind of a standard earthquake that we'll get in California that's due to a tectonic event, say along the San Andreas Fault or along the Owens Valley Fault. They don't come with any warning. They're very rapid onset. You get kind of bam, and then you get a lot of wiggles on the seismometer after it. And we can pretty confidently say that a fault moved or a small fault moved. A lot of around volcanoes, you get that kind of earthquake that's sharp onset, but you also get ones that are a little bit more emergent. They start off small and then they grow, and there are all different flavors of volcanic seismicity. And so our volcano seismologists have gotten really good at figuring out the mechanism, whether this is probably due to gases or fluids or actually magma moving. But it's tricky business, and to try to sort out what those signals are. We'll use a lot of different data streams to do that. One is, trying to measure the deformation of the Earth, measure gases, measure seismicity to really try to come up with the fundamental reason for the activity.
Interesting. Now, Jessica, I know there's a pretty good network of monitors in Yellowstone, keeping track of what's going on there. Is there a similar network around Lassen Peak or Lassen Volcanic National Park?
Yes, there actually is a fairly good network around Lassen Peak. It's one of our better monitored volcanoes, largely because of all the activity we can see there. So at Lassen, we have not only seismometers scattered around the volcano and in the areas around the park and the volcanic field we were talking about. We have very sensitive GPS stations that can help us detect very small movements of the Earth down to sometimes even millimeters if they're working well enough. We have a station that monitors water temperature in one of the hot springs that we think is more active and more prone to changes. And I believe we even have a what we call a multi-gas sensor that monitors the gases coming out of areas like sulfur works to see if the mix of gases changes over time. And the reason we watch that is because magma under the ground releases gas all the time, but normally the gas that makes it to the surface when magma is very deep is carbon dioxide, which is hazardous. You know, if you're in a low area and you're trapped in a pocket of carbon dioxide, you can't breathe, you could suffocate. So it is still a hazardous gas. But what we see when magma moves closer to the surface is more of the sulfur gases. So sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide. Normally, those are, we say, scrubbed out by water in the ground. They're absorbed, they react with the water, and we don't see them on the surface. But when they get to the point where there's so much of them coming off of near surface magma, that's when we know that we have the possibility of an eruption or, at the very least, some sort of intrusion of magma into an area.
Can you think of a time when the monitors alerted you at Bumpus Hill, for instance, that we've got a lot of dangerous gases coming up, we better get the people out of there?
Not so much with the gas monitors. We do see on our seismic stations the occasional earthquake swarm, which is when you have a lot of very small earthquakes in one area, or moving from one part of the subsurface to another. And we usually interpret those at Lassen as being something like fluid movement through the crust. So that could be hot water, that could be acidic fluids, something like that. We haven't seen anything recently that we would consider magma movement. So no huge change in gases or things like that. But we would almost certainly get some notice from the park and the visitors as well, because those sulfur gases are extremely noticeable.
Yeah.
You can smell them a little bit when you go through places like Bumpus Hell or Sulfur Works, but when they really start becoming prolific, you can definitely tell.
Yeah. Is there somewhere on the internet that people can go to watch this data being collected from Lassen?
There is. So the California Volcano Observatory, like all of our observatories, has a website through the USGS. And we have links to all of our monitoring stations there, where you could click on one, say a seismometer, and see the seismic signals that it's picking up almost in real time. I believe our temperature monitor also has a feed that you can look at online. The multi-gas is something that's a little more complicated to interpret, and we don't post that one publicly right away. But were there to be more activity at Lassen that we thought merited, public information, we would make that available.
Maybe this is an obvious question, maybe not. Are any of the volcanics that these there's 5 volcano observatories, I believe, in the U.S., are they related at all? I mean, the regions that you cover, the plumbing systems, I know there's the Rim of Fire that includes the Cascades.
Yeah. So the Hawaiian Observatory, for example, is about as unrelated to the rest of them as you can get. It's one of those blowtorch volcano settings that Andy mentioned earlier. It's in the middle of the Pacific tectonic plate, and what's happening there is a hot spot. So magma rising from depth, hot rock, and mantle material coming up from deep within the Earth and concentrating on that one point in the middle of the plate. Um, in the sense that they're on the edges of the Pacific plate in various places, you could say that the Alaskan volcanoes and the Cascade volcanoes are somewhat related. They have a similar setting, but activity at those disparate volcanoes doesn't have anything to do with each other, nor does Yellowstone. It's a completely different system and a completely different part of a tectonic plate. So we often get questions like this, this one volcano erupted here, is it related to this other volcano erupting somewhere else? And the answer is usually no. But I
Usually.
can let Andy comment on the Cascade volcanoes because Lassen is actually the far southern end of the Cascade Volcanic Arc.
Yeah, there's the whole chain. If you fly up to Seattle or drive I-5 and look off to the right, if you're going north, you'll start with Lassen and go to Shasta, Crater Lake, Three Sisters, Jefferson, Hood, Adams, St. Helens, Rainier, Glacier Peak, all the way up into Canada, Garibaldi. That's all this line of volcanoes. We call them a volcanic arc. And they're all, like Jessica said, largely the same process creates them. So we have there are oceanic rocks offshore that are moving toward North America, diving down beneath North America because it's denser basaltic rock. And when they go down, they carry a lot of water with them, sort of wet sediments, hydrated volcanic rocks. And that as that plate dives down and gets to about a depth of 50 or 80 miles, 60, they're kind of 100 kilometers depth, that water doesn't want to be there, and it boils off. And when you have water, it depresses the melting point for rocks up above it. It causes melting, and that melting works its way up to the surface and causes these volcanoes. So it looks like a line on the surface. And if you can think in 3 dimensions, that's kind of the line where you're about 60 miles above that place where the water likes to boil off. And so they are all, it's a similar process, but the magma, there's not a big magma ocean beneath that. They're sort of discrete pods of magma there's some plumbing system that we don't understand very well that kind of coalesce and cause the melting in these discrete volcanoes along them. And that's the same sort of process you get on that Alaska arc or Kamchatka or the Philippines. That whole ring of fire are these subduction zone volcanoes.
So getting back to Lassen Volcanic National Park, people, if they have an interest in volcanoes, anything specific they should look for when they go visit the park?
The neat thing about Lassen to me is you can see back in time really well. You can see a variety of volcanic deposits. You can see bubbling mud. And the educational, the signs are good. The park is focused on the volcanoes. It's in its name, and there's a lot of good literature and signs. Take the time to read the signs, and you get to use all of your senses. I think you can smell the products of a volcano. You can look at them. You can work to get to the top of them and see a fantastic view of other adjacent volcanoes. You can go to Cinder Cone, which is a lovely hike, and you can see these kind of young landforms and deposits. It's one of the more accessible places on the Earth that you can visit and see just an incredible diversity of volcanic deposits that are million years and younger.
And then go visit Hawaii volcanoes and stand on the edge of Kilauea and watch it at work.
Yeah, and you should do that. You alluded to earlier, are these places dangerous? And they can be. I think that for people that study them, sometimes you can get a little too close, but we've got really good infrastructure in place that they are safe and they're worth visiting. I like to tell people, I tell my kids this, that the most dangerous thing you can do is sit on the couch. And really getting out and experiencing these places has incredible value, and they are steep, and so you need to be careful, and they are smelly and muddy, and you don't want to burn yourself, but it's worth visiting and worth learning about how the system works and how the Earth works. It's one of the better places to visit to understand volcanoes, which is a key way that the Earth works.
Yeah. No, it is really interesting. And, there at Lassen Volcanic, they've got the Devastated Area Trail where you can see what I don't know if it was the 1915 or the 1919 eruption deposited miles away.
Yeah, it's incredible. And that place is changing so quickly. The vegetation's coming back that it's getting harder and harder to see the pyroclastic flows and everything. They're still there, but there's vegetation growing on them. And looking at there are some fantastic pictures that are on interpretive signs there that you can actually see right after that eruption, and then in the kind of 20, 50, now 100 years after it, just how these landforms change. Another interesting place to visit is Mount St. Helens, and that's the same sort of thing. Since 1980, that place, the recovery of a really devastated environment is amazing to watch.
Yeah, no, it is really amazing. That's Andy Calvert and Jessica Ball from the California Volcano Observatory talking about Lassen Volcanic National Park and volcanoes in general in their region. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's been fascinating, and I'd like to try and get out in the field with you. I bet you that'd be even better.
That'd be great.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. There are a great many national parks with volcanic history, and all have interesting stories to tell. To learn more about Lassen's activity, visit the California Volcano Observatory website at usgs.gov/California-Volcano-Observatory and select the Lassen Volcanic Center from the Find a U.S. Volcano drop-down menu on the right-hand side of the page. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.